A big warm welcome especially to those visiting Hayy or visiting Jeddah for the first time. Hayy Jameel is a platform that encourages the exchange of ideas across different cultural fields, and our gallery spaces and programs aim to foster research-based practices across the arts, design, and architecture. The Accommodations exhibition, which traveled to Hayy Jameel from the Venice Biennale, offers a truly special opportunity for our audiences to access these histories and analyses of architectural responses to hosting, enclosing, and housing that are a major part of the identity of Mecca and Jeddah and the economies of the two cities. Having the exhibition coincide with the Islamic Biennale has allowed for a deep discourse to emerge between these two sites, so we're excited about that as well. We're delighted to be hosting today a series of discussions with thinkers from the field of history, architecture, the arts, urban regeneration, and I'd like to express our gratitude to the curators and Studio Bound for putting this program together and to the Tar'iyya Biennale team for their support. I'd also like to thank the Art Jameel team, Iman, Rahul, Ansif, Chris, Barish, Bayan, Yusuf, and the entire Art Jameel team for bringing this symposium to life. I'll introduce the Studio Bound team and the curators of the Accommodations exhibition who have put this wonderful program for us today, and will run us through the discussion and the agenda of the program. So Hassa al-Badr, Basma al-Kaki, and Hassam Daqqaq are the co-founders of Studio Bound, a design and research-based practice founded in 2015, operating between London, Kuwait, and Jeddah. The studio works on projects in the private and public sectors with designers and researchers across many industries. Studio Bound is currently leading a number of key projects in UNESCO heritage sites in Al-Balad and Jeddah, in Al-Ula, as well as key projects along the Red Sea Highway. In 2021, Studio Bound were the architects chosen to represent the Saudi Arabia at the Venice Architecture Biennale, and most recently participated at the first inaugural Islamic Arts Biennale in Jeddah. Murtaza Vali is a critic, curator, and art historian based in Brooklyn and Sharjah, a recipient of the 2011 Creative Capital Warhol Foundation Art Writers Grant for short-form writing. He publishes regularly in art periodicals and exhibition catalogs for nonprofit institutions and commercial galleries around the world, including essays and the monographs on Burki, which launched earlier this week and is published by Art Jameel and Moose Publishing. He's an adjunct curator at the Jameel Art Center in Dubai. Uzma Rizvi is an associate professor at Pratt Institute, Brooklyn, New York, and a visiting faculty at Shah Abdul Latif University, Khairpur, Pakistan. She's the principal investigator of the Laboratory for Integrated Archaeological Visualization and Heritage, an intentionally interdisciplinary, feminist, anti-colonial, and anti-racist space bringing together archaeological research with data management, visualization, and heritage practice. Currently working at the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Mohenjo-Daro, Pakistan. Uzma's work intentionally interweaves archaeology with cultural criticism, philosophy, critical theory, art, and design. Thank you very much, and please welcome Uzma Murtaza.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So I'm the Uzma, part of the Uzma and Murtaza. This is Murtaza. And we're the curators, and it's really our pleasure and joy to welcome you all to today's symposium. We want to begin with a few words of gratitude because it's really important to acknowledge that shows like this don't just happen. They happen with teams and teams of people. And so we want to begin with for the years of support and unwavering belief in our vision. We want to start by thanking Hayy Jameel, actually, who is the chairman and founder of Art Jameel, as well as Antonia Carver, who's the director of Art Jameel. Being invited to represent our exhibition in Jeddah feels like we're bringing this exhibition home, right? And that really is an honor. At Hayy Jameel, we acknowledge the remarkable curatorial and design team here, including Sara Imran, who we just heard from, Rahul Guripuri, as well as Rotana Shakir, Maria Alim, Ayman is here, I think, Ayman Al-Naim, and Dina Al-Khatib, as well as the installation team who did a brilliant job in bringing our exhibition to Jeddah, in particular, I think, Barish and Ansif, who is here. Thank you. So the appointment to curate the National Pavilion for Saudi Arabia from the Ministry of Culture was certainly an honor. But even more meaningful were those many conversations we had with Dr. Sumaya Al-Suleiman, Ala Tarabzuni, Fahad Naif Al-Saud, Valeria Mariani. And as we refined our ideas and curatorial vision, we also worked very closely with an editorial team, including Metha Al-Mazrui, Rachel, Daniel, Sundus, Yara, and just thinking of like everyone we've worked with. And then just in terms of the graphic and the graphic design, we've also worked very closely with Fikra Graphic Design, who are based in Sharjah, with Mariam Al-Qasmi, Salim Al-Qasmi, Hannah, Janan, Mariam, and they were remarkable, and they did quite a bit of work to kind of bring this all together. We are, of course, like when we think about the interlocutors we have throughout our lives, especially those who have informed the kind of rigor of our research, we also wanted to kind of give a special thank you and a shout out to Zainab Ali Raza, Lulua Al-Mana, and Jawahar Al-Suderi, who we'll also be hearing from later on today. So there's certain projects that really bring people together in different ways and kind of make you become family. And this is really one of those projects, and I think in part, or in very large part, because it happened during the pandemic, right? Which is a very different kind of sensibility. So we were appointed by the ministry to be curators for the National Pavilion in the summer of 2020. So this is a time, just to kind of remind us all, this was a time when it was just starting to sink in for most of us that we were in fact in a pandemic. As curators, we were trying to think through like what would we do in this pavilion, and the background was ambulances. Right? Constantly, we heard the sound of ambulances constantly, especially in Brooklyn, which is where we are based. And so we were kind of thinking through, like, how do we answer Hashim Sarkis's theme, how will we live together? And in a time when we are in our homes, and there was a certain kind of lockdown situation, with the ambulance in the background, when you come to that question, it has a very different resonance. Right? It has a very different way in which we're thinking about that. So contending with this new world, it kind of forced us to kind of think in different ways about the built environment and its history and its future.
So I just want to start off by saying one very quick thing, which is that because this exhibition was conceived, realized, and then presented in the context of the pandemic, which has already become kind of feels like history to us. One of the things that Uzma and I weren't able to do was do precisely this sort of a program during its first iteration at Venice. And it is a very large and important part of our role as curators. And so we're actually very, very grateful that we are getting to do this, and actually bringing the exhibition to Hayy is the one thing that has allowed us to do this. So we're very, very grateful for that opportunity, and very, very grateful that all of you guys could join us for this. So I have a few words as a kind of de facto introduction to the events this afternoon. For Uzma and I, the origins of this project are deeply personal, both in ways that may be apparent and others that are less so. First, as she mentioned, we drafted our initial curatorial brief as we came out of 3 long, scary months during which New York was the epicenter of the pandemic that eventually engulfed the globe. It felt urgent and unavoidable for us to reckon with, reflect on, and make sense of what we had just experienced. Paralyzing fear and paranoia, isolation and the safety it provided, but also the privilege that enabled that safety. The quiet courage and sacrifice, not just of heroic medical professionals at the so-called front lines, but all those workers whose labor is usually easily overlooked but was now recognized as essential. The contributions of, quote unquote, those who carry us, to quote the title of the wonderful installation of historical objects and documents by the artist Ahmed Matar that opens the current Islamic Art Biennale. Secondly, for me, as Uzma mentioned, it's bringing the exhibition home, but it also represents a type of personal homecoming. a return to a family home that I've only ever known through stories and as a type of history. Before permanently settling in Sharjah in the early 70s, where I was born and raised, my parents spent 8 years in Medina Al Munawwara. Sorry, I'll take a second. They were young doctors and new parents. You want to read it?
Yeah, I'll read it.
No, okay. Give me a second.
You'll be fine.
They were young doctors and new parents when my father landed a job with the Saudi Ministry of Health. Forced to leave their often sick 1-year-old with her grandparents back in India, they arrived in a foreign land where they couldn't speak the language, had little money, and lived in a single room home using a curtain to carve it up into different spaces. Despite all these hardships, they only ever spoke about their time there with warmth and deep love. And during a sabbatical year in 2016 and 2017, that Uzma and I were blessed to spend with them, my father, his physical and cognitive abilities, slowly but surely compromised through Parkinson's, would regale us with stories of their time in Saudi at lunch every day. One of my many regrets is that I did not think to record him then. They left Medina with heavy hearts, and the community they served, and they eventually became a part of, mourned their departure. As a government employee, my father was required to provide medical services as part of Hajj. And though I haven't been able to find those photographs, I have vivid memories of images of him in his early 30s, dressed in the white of Ihram, administering care in a makeshift medical camp. So the genesis of our interest in the infrastructures of care in Saudi Arabia, and specifically how they adapt to the annual influx of pilgrims during Hajj, also emerges from these very personal memories.
Right. And so this unrelenting spread of the virus made the world intimately familiar with the concept medieval in origin, but exceptional in its use: quarantine, a long-established effective strategy for mitigating the threat of contagion through separation. Medical historians attribute quarantine's origins to Ibn Sina, who first posited the link between infection and its aerosolization, sort of like coming into the air, in his 11th century treatise, Al-Qanun fi al-Tib, which is the canon of medicine. And it was a many-volume sort of piece that really kind of went into why quarantine was important. In that text, he recommends the patient isolate till al-arba'iniyah. Right? Is that how we pronounce it? Al-Ba'iniyah. I just want to make sure I pronounce it correctly. Which is basically the 40th, right? Those 40 days. And it is thought that within that text, he kind of extrapolates how in that time, the air around the patient clears, right? So it takes 40 days for that air to clear. In the 14th century Venice, authorities enforced quarantena, which is 40 days in Italian, a period of offshore isolation for incoming ships and their passengers, to prevent the importation of the plague. So quarantine is at once a containment measure, a contract of non-contact that is at once spatial and temporal. And you'll hear about this as we go through the program later on today. So viruses have also historically been used as very potent metaphors for the foreign, the other, the one from elsewhere. The virus is at once hospice, it's a stranger, it's a guest, and our response to it reveals the limits to the protocols of our care and our ethics of hospitality, which are determined precisely by how the self negotiates the exhortations of the other, one whose unfamiliarity registers as threat. The most common response, which was amplified and accelerated in emergencies such as the pandemic, is imagined, enacted, and enforced through boundaries and enclosures, both literal and figurative. They range in scale from the individual and the collective to the governmental and the national, bisecting bodies and spaces into zones of inclusion and exclusion. And also kind of interestingly, thinking this show really thought a lot about what happens when we exist on that line. So you'll see a lot of lines in the exhibition as you go through it. So their enforcement is biopolitical. It's an imposition of control over the body by the state in the name of common good.
Okay, so now I'm going to read academic stuff, so hopefully I'll hold my self together. In her 2018 book, X-Ray Architecture, architectural historian Beatrice Colomina traces the aesthetics of modern architecture back to the containment and treatment of tuberculosis. She repositions modern architecture not as a discipline of mastery that reshapes nature and society through design paradigms driven by reason and the needs and demands of the human, but as one that is reactive and biopolitical, that registers the effects of the environment and responds to the body, to the patient. Architecture adapts, it accommodates. Building on this thesis, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, she provocatively asserts that at its root, all architecture is sick. Like war, civil strife, economic development or collapse, and gentrifications, outbreaks of disease are also important transformational events, altering the course of history and leaving undeniable traces on the built environment, even if those inscriptions remain invisible or forgotten in the present. Colomina asks us to rethink urbanity as a site of sedimentation, a stratigraphy of spatial responses to crises of public health. Basically, every city is a palimpsest of pandemics past. So Accommodations uses a similar approach, reaching back into the past from a contemporary moment of crisis to begin to excavate the long durée of pandemics in Saudi Arabia, a history that is inextricable from the country's annual obligation to host and house visiting pilgrims during Hajj. Through an examination of a series of spatial case studies related to quarantine, both historical and contemporary, Accommodation seeks to challenge the fixity of the line that Uzma mentioned as an abstraction that marks division or separation, instead inhabiting and populating it, turning it into a space of investigation. Framing these investigations, the concept of accommodation allows a revisiting of these spaces of separation and enclosure, providing insight into the many negotiations of the private and the public, the self and the other, the host and the guest, the state and the citizen that unfold within them. Such mediations are often accommodated at thresholds, at spaces of arrival and reception, where the other first approaches, and the threat associated with it must be assessed and managed. So the exhibition focuses on 3 such thresholds. The first one is the island, which is an extraterritorial enclave whose marginality vis-a-vis the urban center makes it an ideal location for quarantine facilities. The hotel, a structure where hospitality becomes infrastructure, and the home, a refuge of the familiar whose primary function was inverted during the recent pandemic through our forced confinement and near total reliance on digital interfaces for connections with others.
So it's within this context that we've invited interlocutors who will speak through their research and engage with themes that have emerged through the exhibition. So just to quickly run through the 2 different panels. So our first panel is Accommodations and Infrastructure, the Indian Ocean, Hajj and Hospitality. It'll start with a talk by Professor Michael Christopher Lowe, and then we will have a conversation with the Islamic Arts Biennale Artistic Director Sumaya Vali and Hussam Dagak from Studio Bound. We'll have a Q&A after that, a little bit of a break, and then our second panel is on the promises we make, reconciling aspirations and spatial manifestations. And this will be a talk by Ola Hasnan entitled Spatial Matters, Inherent Temporalities. And then there will be a conversation with Jawahar al-Zuderi. We'll then have another break, and then we'll have a conversation with the curators, like with the 2 of us and Studio Bound, just about the process. So with that, I wanted to begin with our first panel, Accommodations and Infrastructure, the Indian Ocean, Hajj and Hospitality. And I'd like to start by introducing Michael Christopher Lowe, who is an assistant professor of history and an incoming director of the Middle East Center at the University of Utah. Lowe earned his PhD from Columbia University in 2015, and from 2015 to 2022, he taught at Iowa State University. He is also a former Senior Humanities Research Fellow for the study of the Arab world at NYU Abu Dhabi. Lowe is the author of Imperial Makkah, Ottoman Arabia and the Indian Ocean Hajj. And this is a Columbia University Press book that came out in 2020 and was quite influential in our exhibition, actually. In 2021, Imperial Makkah received the Middle East Studies Association's Albert Hourani Book Award. Imperial Makkah has also been translated into Arabic and Turkish. He's also the co-editor of The Subjects of Ottoman International Law, which came out from Indiana University Press, also in 2020. He's currently working on a new book exploring environmental histories of water, desalination technology, and climate adaptation in the Arabian Peninsula. The title of his talk is The Global Crisis of Cholera and the Traumatic Birth of the Modern Infrastructures of the Hajj. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lowe.
So first, I just want to offer a very warm thank you to both Uzma and Murtaza for their very kind introduction and for the invitation to be here. And then also, likewise, a thank you to my fellow panelists, Hussam Dakak and Sumaya Vali. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here with you today. I wanted to just say a quick word about what I was trying to sort of get across here with this sort of superimposed image. We have a sort of a postcard of a steamship coming from Bombay to Jeddah, and then superimposed over that is an Ottoman map of the spread of cholera. And if you can just see in the middle there, India, the sort of the subcontinent as the epicenter of cholera in the 19th century. And really, this was what I was trying to do with my book, Imperial Mecca, was to put these two stories, one of the British Raj in India and its sort of ecological and medical catastrophes in conversation with the history of the Arabian Peninsula and, of course, the late Ottoman Empire as well. So I'd like to begin by telling you a bit about my own journey to this topic. This is a photograph of me among the ruins of the Ottoman Red Sea quarantine station on Cameron Island, not far from Hudaydah in Yemen. In 2006, I was studying Arabic in Sana'a and had set out on a kind of amateur expedition to find the quarantine site with, honestly, really nothing more than a photocopied World War I British-era map. And this, island sort of desert landscape, there really is not that much to sort of guide the way in terms of what's left, but I was able to sort of piece together the sort of buildings that remain. What I found there was a kind of puzzle that would occupy me for the better part of, say, 15 years. It took me to Istanbul, to London, to Cairo, to India, to Singapore, collecting sources in English, Arabic, Turkish, and Ottoman Turkish. And parenthetically, you can ask me in the Q&A sort of about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was not part of my research, and that actually is an important part of the story in some respects. And we can maybe talk a little bit more about that. I wanted to tell the story of Indian and Southeast Asian pilgrims whose journeys to Mecca were interrupted and often ended by the 19th century's great pandemic disease, cholera. Really, this place was a kind of a seed that grew into my book, Imperial Mecca. But little did I know that when I started to write this book about an age of pandemics, really a world of pandemics, that the book would actually be published in 2020 in the midst of our own pandemic moment with COVID-19. Ultimately, I believe that this changed the way that people read the book and actually made it much more relevant, and I think that's in evidence in this exhibition. As I walked through the stunning exhibits of the Islamic Arts Biennale this week, and of course also Accommodations here, I was reminded of some of the reasons that I became interested in writing this book. As dazzling as the gilded doors of the Kaaba or the gold embroidery of the Kiswa are, I think we understandably focus perhaps a little bit too much on the timelessness of the destination. Often the pilgrim's memory of Hajj focuses on the beauty and the spirituality of the tawaf, but telling the story of the Hajj, I think, is also about the journey. And the journey changes sometimes quite dramatically. In some ways, the safe and comfortable infrastructures of airports, rail links, hotels, public health service, and surveillance as well, virtually perfected by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, I think it makes it harder for us to remember that until the 20th century, the Hajj was an incredibly dangerous and harrowing undertaking. Indeed, we might even forget some of the suffering, sacrifice, and the courage of those earlier pilgrims. Now, I admit, as a non-Muslim, it is perhaps not my place to try and explain the feelings of awe, communal solidarity, and the blessings of the Hajj experience. That said, in a way, I've come to see this as a kind of, this potential weakness, let's say, as a kind of strength in my research and writing. As I was flying in from the US this week, in Doha, my flight was filled with families making their way to Umrah, often including 3 generations dressed in their ihram clothes. Unlike these pilgrims, of course, I didn't grow up with a sense of what these traditions meant. I had to learn these things mostly through books and travel. Now, I always approach this subject, I hope, with a strong dose of humility. Now, that said, in a way, my own foreignness meant that I needed to understand the Hajj process in a very different way as a historian and a scholar. Thus, instead of thinking of barakah, or the spiritual emotions of the tawaf, I tried to understand how the parts of the Hajj worked a little bit more mechanically, almost like a clockmaker. And in this respect, I tried to kind of take apart the various infrastructures, the machinery of the Hajj. I wanted to understand, in a sense, the gears and the springs of this travel machine. I wanted to understand the day-to-day mundane details, the messy mechanics of the modern pilgrimage travel experience, and the ways that the arrival of steamships, railways, telegraphs, really all brought a kind of colonial capitalist space-time that forever changed the traditional rhythms of the caravan Hajj. I wanted to understand how Ottoman bureaucrats, European colonial powers, the sharifs of Mecca, and the businessmen of Jeddah managed the new infrastructures of this modern Hajj. Now, in many ways, I think my book was about a kind of infrastructural competition, about competing imperial state-building projects. On the one hand, an Ottoman modernizing project from Istanbul, which rode the railways of the Hijaz Rail, but also a British Indian steamship model that was in direct competition here. So here we see, of course, in the top left-hand corner, a steamship coming from India. In the bottom left-hand corner, we actually have Ottoman or Turkish pilgrims praying on a steamship headed from Istanbul or from present-day Turkey. And then we see in the middle 2 images, one of pilgrims riding the rails, but also of a station along the Hijaz Railway, perhaps in Tabuk or Al-Ula, some place like that. We also see here in the right-hand corner an Ottoman map of the route of the telegraph line, which actually was a kind of an experiment to see what the proper route of the Hijaz Railway might look like. This preceded, actually, the construction of the railway. And then finally, of course, in the right-hand corner, we have the more traditional camel experience. But this gives you a sense of kind of the competing modes of transport and communication and the different rhythms and times of the Hajj. In this talk, I really would like to explore how the 19th century and the birth of the steamship brought the industrialization and the mechanization of the Hajj. And in turn, I hope to show how this period of rapid change, tremendous suffering, and colonial racialization of Muslims eventually gave birth to the relative safety and comfort of today's Hajj infrastructures. Here we see a map that really just depicts the principal routes of the Indian Ocean Hajj. I want to make the argument that the industrialization of steam shipping increased, of course, transoceanic travel and global commerce. These things all went hand in hand, and yet steam-powered colonialism was also a kind of double-edged sword. It also had the unintended consequence of forging ever faster and more interconnected pathways for the spread of deadly pathogens, not unlike air travel does in our current context. So here again we see the map from the great Ottoman physician Basim Omer depicting the spread of cholera. If the steamship was the sort of the broader genre of mobility that enabled cholera to leap beyond its previous endemic range in India's Ganges Delta, it was the birth of a steam-powered pilgrimage travel industry that made the Hajj to Mecca the ideal vehicle for cholera's global circulation beyond India. Unfortunately, the steamship Hajj also produced the first global crisis of Muslim mobility. Muslims during this period were racialized, pathologized, and singled out as the most dangerous carriers of microbes and even subversive, even uniquely violent ideas. In many respects, the plight of steamship-going Muslims and the way that they were treated by colonial and imperial regimes even invites a kind of loose comparison with the present. Today, the Islamophobia of the post-9/11 era has branded Muslims worldwide, even the most vulnerable refugee populations, as potential terrorists, giving rise to additional border security, stringent passport and visa controls, racial profiling, and even outright travel bans. Now, we might imagine these things as being new in the last 2 decades, but I make the argument that Western attempts to restrict Muslim travel, mobility, and migration share an intellectual lineage that was already forged in the middle of the 19th century. Now, I won't dwell on the exact mechanisms of cholera, how it works. Obviously, we know cholera is a waterborne diarrheal illness, but I think that these cartoon images give us some sense of the gruesomeness, the horror, the shock of what cholera looked and felt like. The archive is replete with descriptions of people turning into essentially zombie-like figures. They turn blue because of the extreme dehydration of the body, and eventually even the fingernails turn a sort of almost bright purple because all the fluids are sucked out of the body. And so we can imagine just how terrifying this disease was that could carry a human being away within a matter of hours or days. So how does this relate? What's the connection with the Hajj and the Hijaz? Mecca and the Hijaz had seen at least 7 outbreaks of varying severity between 1831 and 1860. Then, of course, there was the great 1865 outbreak, which killed some 15,000 to 30,000 pilgrims and sparked a global pandemic. Cholera broke out during every Hajj season from 1881 to 1883. This was another kind of moment of climax. In 1883, cholera would spread to Egypt, killing approximately 50,000. Perhaps the worst year, though, came in 1893, with estimates of as many as 30,000 to 50,000 pilgrims killed in the Hajj al-Akbar season of 1893. I think for a kind of overall perspective, the birth of the steamship meant that the overall numbers of pilgrims rose from perhaps 50,000 around 1850 to over 200,000 to 300,000 by the time we get to World War I. So I want you to imagine, if you've ever walked around the walls of Al-Balad, it's not a large place, right? Imagine at this time period, the whole of the Hijaz, the population, was maybe 300,000 to 400,000 people, and maybe Al-Balad, 40,000 people. And then you add in an additional 300,000 people into that tiny space. Of course, this would be a kind of recipe for pandemic disaster. Now, I want to address the connection with India a bit. In late Victorian Holocaust, El Nino and the Making of the Third World, Mike Davis paints a kind of all-encompassing portrait of colonial India's ecological and demographic implosion. Davis argues that while natural factors such as altered El Nino patterns and failed monsoon cycles might have contributed to the 19th century's catastrophic mortality rates, the synergistic relationship between drought, famine, malaria, plague, and cholera were in fact man-made crises born of colonial India's unjust economic and political systems. Regardless of whether one, I think, places more emphasis on human, technical, or environmental factors, colonial India's death tolls are simply staggering. Between 1817 and 1865, we think some 15 million Indians died from cholera alone. Between 1865 and 1947, an additional 23 million. And of course, many cholera cases were falsely recorded as dysentery or so-called famine diarrhea in order to avoid the threat of international quarantines being imposed on Britain's lucrative India trade. Elsewhere, I've written quite a lot about Britain's, let's say, denialism about cholera. They really didn't want to admit that this was a problem because it got in the way of business, essentially. Working in tandem, the vicious cycles of famine, dislocation, and cholera set in motion a public health crisis that would assume global proportions. Though cholera had long been endemic in Bengal, over the course of the 19th century, it rapidly expanded throughout the world. Unlike the outbreaks of pre-colonial times, however, new patterns of British trade and military movement, eventually intensified by steam and rail, allowed the disease to burst beyond its previous endemic range. Pre-colonial patterns of cholera outbreaks, of course, were thought to have revolved around Hindu pilgrimage circuits. Large crowds of celebrants contracted the disease and carried the infection back home, where it would run its deadly but still largely local course. However, with the steamship, cholera didn't simply burn out. The steamship created entirely new circuits, allowing India's disease pool to spill over into the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf the Ottoman Empire, Europe, and the rest of the globe. Freed from the rhythms of sailing in accordance with the monsoon cycle, the costs of transport and the length of passage for Indian Ocean pilgrims traveling after the introduction of the steamship were reduced drastically. The relative affordability of the steamship-era Hajj also made the journey possible for a group identified, fairly or not, by both European and Ottoman Muslim authorities as a dangerous class of so-called pauper pilgrims, fuqara, meskin. As the numbers of destitute pilgrims rose, so too did the incidence of death and disease in the Hijaz. By the 1860s, international consensus was converging on the connection between India's pilgrim masses and the dissemination of epidemic disease. Over time, in addition to quarantine procedures, concerns over poor pilgrims also led to the rise of passport and visa systems and even round-trip Hajj packages, something that we might think of as a 20th century thing actually came from the 19th century. All of these interventions were meant to count, document, and surveil all pilgrims moving in and out of the Hijaz. Here, of course, we see a collection of British passports, Ottoman murur tezkeresis. We see on the top left-hand corner, this is the Ottoman murur tezkeresi, which you might call a passport, but it's really an internal passport. It's more like a visa. And each pilgrim would receive a murur tezkeresi when they would arrive in Jeddah. This was also a way for the Ottomans then to potentially link them into Ottoman record keeping for naturalization. Let's say you're an Indian and you become a mujawir and you live in Mecca. Maybe you want to become an Ottoman subject. The murur tezkeresi was the linkage, right? In the middle, we have the Indian pilgrim passport. At the bottom left here, we have Thomas Cook & Son, the famous travel agency, now out of business, unfortunately. We did manage to save the archive. It was about to be sold off by the bankers, but a lot of angry letters saved those really fantastic pieces of ephemera. And then finally, this one's just for fun. I bet you didn't know that camels needed their own passport, but in fact, the camel caravans from Egypt, there was such a thing in the 19th century. Maybe not the most relevant for our purposes, but I really love this piece, courtesy of the Khalili Family Trust. Now, while today we think of passports, visas, and modern borders as a natural part of travel, this system is quite new. Before World War I, Hajj pilgrims were part of one of the first global experiments with the international passport system, complete with, of course, its racialized hierarchies. Even today, we might hear pilgrims grumble about Hajj quotas and bureaucracy of Saudi Arabia's systems. However, I would remind you that the system that is in use today by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is meant to prevent the tragedies and the suffering of the 19th century Hajj, which was, of course, relatively lightly regulated. The international breaking point for this crisis of cholera and so-called pauper pilgrims came in 1865. This was a Hajj Akbar season when the standing at Mount Arafat falls on a Friday. Because such years are considered to be particularly auspicious, the number of pilgrims ballooned to 4 times more than the previous year's attendance, leading to overcrowding, food and water shortages, and a perfect environment for the spread of cholera. Now, although numbers vary wildly, we think that some 30,000 out of about 150,000 pilgrims died that year. So 1 in 5 pilgrims expired in this really terrible catastrophe. To make matters worse, when steamships of returning pilgrims arrived at Suez in May of that year, it was falsely reported that there was no cholera. But in fact, the ship captains had dumped 2 bodies overboard, and it went unreported. Of course, this brought the pandemic to Egypt and killed 60,000 Egyptians. From there, it spread to Beirut, to Istanbul, to Marseille, to Algiers, ravaging its way across Anatolia, Europe, Russia, and all the way to New York City. We know that between 1865 and 1874, something like 200,000 people died in European and American cities alone. Now, as the global pandemic of 1865-66 unfolded, international attention was to focus squarely on the Hajj. And I think this is a very important moment because it's the first time that Europeans and the international community essentially come to take over parts of the administration of the most important rite in Islam. Now, in an age of sanitarian reform, Western Europe had already begun to take halting steps towards a kind of environmental reorganization of cities, water supplies, and waste disposal. These projects, although still operating without the benefit of proper germ theory, had nevertheless begun to push adult mortality rates downward. On the other hand, European observers saw none of this progress in the Ottoman Empire, in Iran, India, points further east. Thus, Europeans believed that to protect themselves, they had to encourage sanitary reform across the globe, not just in Europe. Now, in 1866, we see this image of the arrival of one of the most important figures, Ali Pasha, to the Istanbul International Sanitary Conference at the Galatasaray Lisesi. Now, for our purposes, arguably the most important outcome of this conference was the decision to adopt rigorous quarantine measures designed to inspect the health of all pilgrims arriving in the Hijaz. Although it would take more than a decade and a half for these plans to really come to fruition, the proposals laid out in 1866 would eventually lead to the establishment of an archipelago of quarantine stations stretching from the southern mouth of the Red Sea to the Suez Canal and actually into the Mediterranean and along the Black Sea as well. This system was to be anchored by a flagship quarantine station at Cameron Island, positioned in the vicinity of the Bab al-Mandeb, in order to intercept the growing influx of Indian Ocean pilgrims before they could reach Mecca's principal port, Jeddah. Although its staffing and administration were to be handled by the Ottoman state, it would also be subject to international supervision of the mixed Ottoman Board of Health, which included, of course, European members overseeing the work of the Ottomans. Here we see between 1866 and even before the opening of the Cameron Island station in 1882, the Hijaz sanitary commissions that were meant to oversee sanitary operations in Jeddah, in Mecca, and the rest of the Hijaz. Now here we see a map. You can see this red dot depicts the location of Cameron Island, again a little bit north of Hudaydah, close to a tiny dot on the map, Salif. We see on the left-hand side here an Ottoman map. They were trying to put in buoys because of the very shallow entrance to the island. We see another British version of the same locality. As I mentioned before, this was kind of my entree to this question. Actually, this photograph appears in the exhibition as you're moving through accommodations in the top left-hand corner. This was my photograph from 2006 from Cameron. And then you see some of the circa 1900, 1902 photos of some of the Ottoman quarantine structures. We see up in the top right-hand corner this atik structure, kind of thatched roofing. Pilgrims really love to complain about how poor this early structure was from the 1880s. Then later we get brick and mortar structures after 1900. Now, in addition to the primitive conditions, the station failed, I think, in the more important respect. Hijaz and Cameron Island were ripe for change. The tragedies of the early 1890s proved a kind of tipping point, both within the Ottoman Empire and internationally. In the wake of fresh outbreaks in 1890, 91, and then again in the Hajj Akbar season of 1893, we see it just a kind of catastrophic chain of destruction. Up to 3,000 pilgrims were dying in Mecca in 1893 per day, according to the Egyptian physician Abdul Hamid Shafi. I want to show a picture, and I apologize for the graphic nature of this illustration, but I think it's important for us to see the way that Europeans thought of Mecca and the Hajj during this time period. We see, of course, corpses being moved on the left-hand side, and of course cadavers being, eaten by vultures. And again, the reason that I want to show this is to sort of underscore the horrific nature of this sort of climactic moment of the 1890s. As Abdul Hamid Shafi points out, in many neighborhoods, corpses were being buried without notifying the public health authorities. Likewise, local families were so desperate that they abandoned the cemeteries and began to bury the dead in their courtyards and the gardens of their homes. As the corpses multiplied, the porters responsible for burying the dead died themselves. Then the military, the Ottoman military, stepped in. Diyarbakirli Ferik Osman Pasha, who was the Hijaz's commanding officer, he sent his troops to bury the dead. And then he himself died of cholera. And this culminates with 30,000 dead in the 1893 season. By 1883-84, German bacteriologist Robert Koch, here on the right-hand side of the screen, his research in Egypt and India provided definitive proof of cholera's causal agent, the so-called Comma bacillus. Koch's discovery of the role of the human intestinal tract in the bacterium's life cycle and his confirmation of cholera's waterborne transmission were quite important and really sort of started progress towards eradicating cholera from the Hajj, but it would take quite a long time. Eventually, this discovery started to change the way that Ottoman and European officials sought to deal with cholera. On the other side here, we have Bąkowski Pasha, Charles Bąkowski Pasha. He's an immigrant from Poland who was brought up in the Ottoman Empire and eventually becomes, again, a pasha and the Ottoman Empire's top sanitary official. In 1894, he announces the reorganization of the Camaran station and essentially its complete overhaul. He brings in disinfection stoves, sterilizing machines, water filtration or condenser machines, ice makers, mobile receptacles for the removal of feces, a whole host of new interventions. I want to just take a few moments here to underscore a few of the more important ones. Of course, in my research, I found that by the 1870s, Mecca's water infrastructures, of course we see these pipes here on the top left, a map from the 1840s of the Ain Zubaydah aqueduct system, of course the water carriers. But I came to this document in the 1890s, and it was the first time that the Ottomans brought in desalination machines. And I was really just shocked. I mean, I sort of rubbed my eyes when I saw the document and said, is this really possible as early as the 1890s? And of course, ultimately, this leads to this machine that was brought in 1911. This was the centerpiece of Jeddah's first desalination plant. And I want to make the argument that this was a kind of revolution, not only for Jeddah, but for all of the Arabian Peninsula. Of course, eventually, this was replaced in the 1920s by King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, and he was able to purchase a couple of new units which came to be known by locals affectionately, or perhaps not affectionately, as al-Kandasa. We can see the poem here from Muhammad Said Otaili talking about kind of the rocky start of desalination in Jeddah and how tough it was for the local population. I want to just sort of point out that, we tend to think of these kinds of interventions and really revolutionary infrastructures as a product of oil, but they have a prehistory long before the 1960s and 1970s. Of course, eventually we end up with the modern large-scale desalination units brought in with American cooperation by Prince Mohammed bin Faisal, sometimes known for his crazy scheme to tow icebergs from Antarctica to Jeddah, but he really was revolutionary. And this sets in motion really the creation of the Saline Water Conversion Corporation, which is the world's largest producer of man-made water. So I just want to make the argument that these Hajj tragedies actually have a silver lining for us in the 20th century. But I just want to conclude very briefly and just say how desalination is only one example of how the global crisis of cholera helped to shape the modern kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Even with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire during World War I, the Ottoman quarantine system, of course, didn't simply disappear. Instead, it became a responsibility of the colonial powers. When the fledgling kingdom of Saudi Arabia conquered Mecca in 1925, the Saudis theoretically took over political and religious control of the Hajj. However, the public health and quarantine systems surrounding the steamship Hajj remained under the supervision of European colonial states. Following the drafting of an International Sanitary Convention in 1926, a League of Nations office was established in Paris and coordinated public health controls over Mecca with the Egyptian Quarantine Board. This system would remain in effect until the World Health Organization's creation in 1948. And then even then, after the creation of the Ministry of Hajj in 1951, Saudi Arabia still wasn't fully in control of all of the public health infrastructures. This wouldn't come until 1957. Now, in 1925, in his welcome address to pilgrims, King Abdulaziz sought to distinguish himself from the suffering of the late Ottoman and Hashemite periods. As he put it, "You are aware that the previous rulers of the Hijaz used to treat pilgrims badly and despotically, but by the grace of God, we shall try to do far better and put an end to this practice. To be sure, this promise was partly about stopping Bedouin raiding of caravans and the profiteering of the Hashemites. However, I also believe that the deadly decades of cholera and the embarrassment of European colonial intervention into the administration of the Hajj, the most holy rite of Islam, also marked the Saudi state with a deep sense of responsibility. In other words, the kingdom is deeply aware of this history and its infrastructural and public health responsibilities as Khadam al-Haramain al-Sharafain. Since taking over control of the public health system surrounding the Hajj, Saudi Arabia has had to take precautions against cholera, polio, swine flu, Ebola, SARS, and Middle East respiratory syndrome. To be sure, there have been deaths, stampedes, and construction accidents in the past century. But of course, these have been few and far between, and nothing like the sustained suffering of the pre-Saudi period. The proof of Saudi Arabia's maturity, I think, comes in our current pandemic moment. The maturity of Saudi Arabia in 2020 of really stopping the international Hajj and having a symbolic, scaled-down, smaller Hajj. Now, I remember at that moment, in that moment, Western newspapers said, oh, there will be Muslim fanaticism, people won't stand for it. But of course, that didn't come to fruition at all. And we really see the sort of responsible decision-making. And I just want to underscore this, that as we sort of walk around the Biennale and accommodations, I want us to think about the Western Hajj Terminal, the rail link of the Haramain high-speed railway, and think about this as a kind of a golden age where the lessons of the 19th century have been put into practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You join us here? Yeah, thank you so much for that, Chris. You know, one of the things I love about historians is that they remind us that we are not exceptional in our time. That in fact we have experienced so much of this. I'm going to invite Islamic Arts Biennale Artistic Director Sumaya Vali and Hussam Nakak from Studio Bound. I'm going to do some quick introductions if you can join us here, and Murtaza if you can join us. So Hussam Nakak is an architect based in London and Jeddah. He's a partner in Studio Bound, and he's served as program director of the AA Jeddah Visiting School since 2015. Nakak holds an MA in architecture from the Architectural Association in London and is an ARB registered architect. He completed his professional training in London, working with several notable developments in the UK and the Gulf. He currently serves as a design and development lead for Rasmal. Is that right? Yeah. He also serves as a consultant on several cultural and architectural projects, and currently is also principal of the award-winning architecture and research firm Counterspace. Her design process is often forensic and draws upon oral performance and the overlooked as generative places of history and work. In 2019, Counterspace was invited to design the 20th Serpentine Pavilion in London, making Sumaya the youngest architect ever to win this internationally renowned commission. With the Serpentine, she initiated and developed a new fellowship program, Support Structures for Support Structures, which assists artists and collectives working at the intersection of art with social justice, the archive, and ecology. Vali is also currently leading a new master's program entitled Hijra at the Royal College of Art and is an honorary professor in practice at the Bartlett School of Architecture. Again, our artistic director for the Islamic Arts Biennale, and with that I'm going to leave it to you, Murtaza, to take care of some of the questions and have the conversation. Is it on? Can everyone just check there? No.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. So rich, so much important history. I'm going to start off actually by asking Hussam a question, and then I'll go back to two of you, just as a way of building on it, rather than asking a very specific question about it. So Hussam, I know that Professor Lowe's book was quite important in the research, and you and Hassan Rasma really built on this idea of the island as a type of, almost a type of typology for
Chris, how the mechanics of Hajj and how all these different infrastructures had the capacity to not only inform policy, but also to inform the expansion of the state and also the expansion of territory. And I think that in itself was very important for us, how architecture functions not only as pure stagecraft, but also as statecraft itself. And here I'm referencing Easterlin's work, which was also very seminal for us, this notion of extra statecraft. So in turn, really that was one of the fundamental points of, well, one of the many points which really struck us with Chris's work. And as you've also underlined, all of this predates oil. And it's really like a lot of the different mechanics that currently exist, whether it's with treating any pandemic or like dealing with Hajj really existed way before a time which we didn't even think of. So that was really, I think, very important. But also, one of the novelties within Chris's work, which was very important which actually for me was really interesting, is the birth of the passport itself. Because that also speaks something to beyond architecture, but it also speaks to how a spatial circumstance or a global circumstance is manifested into something that's even down to as important as a passport, which becomes this device for monitoring movement and for monitoring circulation. And we really speak about circulation a lot in our, I think it's underpinned a lot in our exhibition, this notion of circulation, whether it's rendered through a gate, for example, as we discussed in the home space, but even more, not simply, but more actually in a more complex way, like the birth of the passport. So these are just some of the high-level strands that really struck me.
In terms of spatial elements across Jeddah, because the island section is really around Jeddah, but the port is the doorway to Makkah, to Hajj. Can you talk about some of the kind of examples of spatial conditions, I guess, through the 20th century that you guys uncovered in your research? Things that are, you showcase in each of the items.
Yeah, so there are multiple examples. I think an important, a 20th century example, which is very important, is the one that you kind of see a bit of the screen here. This was the first quarantine station that was built by modern-day Saudi Arabia. And the reason I point this out because it's one of the last things that Chris pointed out. It's only up until the erection of this facility in the south of Jeddah that Saudi demonstrated its capacity to the World Health Organization and to the rest of the world that it was able to reclaim control over its medical borders, well after the establishment of the state in 1957. And across the spectrum, across the other side of the room, we have a different facility attributed to Hajj, which is that Modern Hajj, which is like a quasi-urban settlement, which was different, like there were different settlements that emerged in Jeddah whose sole purpose was to accommodate the incoming influx of pilgrims. And what was interesting about Modern Hajj, like many of these different threads of exploration, is the scale of it, really. And it wasn't a constraint to a certain building, but it was really more about the neighborhood. And its growth and its scale really actually starts to speak also to the large number of pilgrims that were coming in. So for me, those two maybe definitely highlight as being quite important. And again, arguably one of the most interesting ones is the first island, which is first enter, which speaks about all the different quarantine facilities along the Red Sea coastline, which Chris, again, speaks quite deeply about in his book and research, be it from Qamran Island all the way up to Food in Egypt. But those are three moments that really stand out and tie in quite well, I think, to what Chris was talking about.
Okay, so I'd like to shift to Sumaya, and thank you so much for joining us. I know you're a busy person. But I was struck actually, I was lucky enough to spend a little bit of time at the Islamic Art Biennale yesterday, and I was struck by 2 points of overlap. One is migration, which with your exhibition you present specifically through the Hijra, but in some sense it is migration, and about how Muslim ritual site or in spite of some sort of displacement. So that was one, and then the other was ritual use of water, which again in the Saudi Pavilion only comes to the notion of wudu, but clearly it's very important to accommodations as well, but also to Chris's book, To the Indian Ocean. And so I wanted to kind of ask you to maybe expand a little bit on those two ideas. And actually, now that I'm sitting here, I'm also thinking about whether the Indian Ocean somehow also connects, for you as a point of connection from Jeddah to South Africa. I'm not sure about those parts of migration, so that's an open question.
Thanks so much, and thank you for having me. It's been such an honor to be spending time with all of you over the last few days. Of course, an honor to see Hussam's work and to understand the overlaps throughout his methods of practice, and Chris, of course, to listen to you as well. Yes, so Hijra, as it's presented in the Biennale, starts from the idea of the Prophet's Hijra, when he moved from Makkah to Medina because he was fleeing persecution. And we reflect on that as a really important moment that through which the Islamic calendar is marked, and you know, it's how we start to count Islamic time. But in the Biennale, we're really reflecting also on, as you mentioned, this idea that our rituals of community are what grounds us. They are our first principles of belonging after displacement, after migration, or no matter where people are in the world. And throughout the exhibition, inside the galleries and also outside, we continuously reflect on what these first principles of belonging are, what are the infrastructures and ingredients of community, food, sound, celebration, how we share in loss and worship, and how these are really the infrastructures of belonging. They are how we identify and they are how we come together. But the theme of migration then also extends to thinking about Jeddah and the Hijaz more broadly as a nexus of cultural production and migration. And it reflects on the idea that this place has always been synonymous with movement and migration. We're introduced to that idea, as you saw, in the reception area of the Biennale, where we have artifacts from along the Zubaydah route, curated by my co-curator, Dr. Saleh Rashid. We were really understanding that just by virtue of the fact that there were these large-scale infrastructures, there were water wells which allowed people to stop along the route, this became a place that became very important for the cultural exchange of knowledge, for people to share and trade. People started to bleed and blend into each other's cultures. And then broadly throughout the Biennale outside, we really also reflect on how, throughout the ages, this place has really been an nexus for cultural production. So we see this, for example, in Brick Lab's work, where they're looking at the airport rooms accommodation, and it's also a place where Malcolm X stayed. We saw a postcard that he wrote from there a little bit earlier on. And again, just by virtue of the fact that so many people from all over the world stayed in this place, it became a place that really generated a wealth of cultural production. We hear oral accounts of people who talk about carpets from Afghanistan being traded there. We hear people talk about coming over to the building to welcome pilgrims from all over the world. And Malcolm X himself also wrote about how formative this time was in his life. So just by virtue of seeing and interacting with people from around the world with this common purpose, that it became very important also to his politics. And on the theme of water, you're absolutely right. Again, I think we reflect on it in the Biennale through various scales, and it starts with the scale of what our bodies are made of and the rituals of performing wudu, that these are about our bodies interacting and connecting with what we're made of, with the essential elements. And our purification through wudu is about us touching water 5 times a day. If water is not available, then we perform tayammum and we touch earth. But we also then reflect on water through various scales, the scale of ecology and diaspora in the world. I'm also Muslim Indian heritage, which of course is very complex. And I think that the Indian Ocean has always had a role in my life, and I recently have been reading works by Seema Alvi, Muslim cosmopolitanism, and they talk about the ways that because they had so many facets of their identity, they were able to move from the cadences of one language to another. They were able to somehow culturally shift between conditions, between what it meant to be Indian and what it meant to be Muslim, without any seeming contradiction. And by virtue of the fact that they contained all this hybridity, they were somehow bolstered, by empire in the routes that they took and how these routes were set up across the Indian Ocean. But they were also resisting it at the same time. And in my own practice, I think I've chosen to take the stance that this hybridity and these complications we have in our identities are actually forms of power. They're how we resonate with each other. And this is something I wanted to reflect in the Biennale as well, that we're all united through our rituals, and there are things that we universally express and experience as Muslims. But we also have a diversity of practices, and I hope that that's also visible.
Great. You see what you want to respond, so I'm going to let you do that first.
I mean, it resonates so much. You mentioned Seema Alavi's work, which was an influence on some of the work that I did in my book, and just this idea of Mecca as a kind of cosmopolis that was a symbol of resistance to colonialism. And really that was at the sort of heart of my book, is this Ottoman attempt to keep the Hijaz and Mecca out of the hands of colonial rule. But just thinking about Hijra as well, or maybe Mecca as a place of exile. I mean, one of the characters in Seema Alavi's book and also in mine is Said Fadl al-Awali. And Said Fadl, he gets into some trouble with Britain in the 1850s and goes into exile in Mecca. And from then on, essentially, the British sort of see him as kind of centerpiece for potential contagion of anti-colonialism, right? And so I think there's this way in which Mecca can kind of be this way to think about anti-colonial exile as well.
I'm going to follow that up with a somewhat unrelated question, but picking up of a metaphor that you present in your paper, this idea of the historical clock paper. And I was kind of struck by the resonance between that and your lovely kind of phrase between statecraft and stagecraft, and how craft, like clock making, clock fixing is a craft. So I guess maybe you can start off by responding specifically, and then the two of you can also, as architects yourselves, reflect on this idea of the relationship between architecture and craft, like statecraft versus stagecraft, and also the relationship to infrastructure, and also ways in which architecture can present ways of better understanding, ways in which certain types of crafting are not successful and suggest other alternatives. And I think we'll get a chance to talk about that more in the afternoon panel. Start off with Chris.
Sure. I mean, in some respects, this idea of time, responding to Nile Green's wonderful essay, "The Hajj is its own doing." And Green posits this idea that colonial infrastructures create a new kind of colonial capitalist space-time. And that as, let's say, Indians or other nationalities are making their way on Hajj, they're also learning about the new infrastructures of the modern world. But then he posits this shift. When you arrive in Jeddah, then the Hajj time slows down. You get on the back of a camel, and then you have the old Muslim Islamic space-time. And I make the argument in my book that actually I disagree vehemently with this. In fact, you have a sort of alternate project from the Ottomans to essentially bring modern infrastructures to the region, whether it be passports, quarantines, steamships, railways, telegraphs, that in fact
Hijaz never really escaped. In fact, Bedouins themselves became sucked into this Indian Ocean steamship capitalist universe. So there's actually not this sort of dichotomy. But I kind of think my project was, again, I posited this sort of question of weakness. A non-Muslim from halfway across the world. I thought that what I can do is sort of take apart these pieces of empire and sort of order them and do something a little bit different than examining the written narratives, the safarnames, the sort of pilgrim's diaries, to look at the sort of bureaucratic minutiae and sort of day-to-day messy mechanics of how Mecca and Jeddah and Hijaz actually work as real material places. Yes, they're spiritual places, but they're made of brick and mortar as well.
So just to maybe clarify what I was trying to get at, I guess what I'm saying is that you kind of reveal the structure as architects, you guys envision new structures. So you craft state and you craft stage, and you also craft space. So maybe the two of you can reflect on that, and then we'll open it up.
I think a couple of points which I just want to highlight. The first one is we talk so much about architecture as stage and statecraft, but at least in our studio, a lot of the work that I want to highlight is, and related to our work in the Biennale actually, yes, a lot, when we say architecture as state or stagecraft, it's the presence of that building or structure, but in many cases, it's also the absence of it that also speaks to this agency of statecraft and statecraft, especially in a place like Mecca, which has a rapidly changing landscape. So the absence of architecture itself and its evolutionary cyclicality is another version of the statecraft, which we talk about a lot. And this was rendered in our piece in the Biennale because we talk so much about the sacred spaces of Mecca and their past, present, but also in the future as well. So that's one important distinction I wanted to highlight. And just going back slightly to a point that Chris, I think you made in how Mecca stands as an antidote to colonialism, or basically resisted any external, well, to some degree. And what resonated for me at least, and I'll bring it back to the Biennale in a second, but were the images you showed, the depiction of Hajj as a plague, or as this like super post-apocalyptic, tragic circumstance. And for me, what was like when you look at those images and you counter those with the images and that the Biennale brings forth, it's a complete counterweight to that. And that's where I think it's basically two opposite sides of the spectrum. And I think this is what the Biennale does very well, is that we're trying to, and I think Sumaya can speak more to this, but as Muslims and as a global Muslim population, we really want to reclaim the narrative of what it is to be Muslim, or how we're supposed to depict, even in more broader terms, Islamic art or Hajj or etc.
Thank you. It's beautiful. Yeah, I agree. I think there's been an intention in this theme of the Biennale, and also the way that we've selected artists and crafted the works of the Biennale to really put forth a different definition for Islamic art that is made by our perspectives and our voices, and I think also puts forth a very different image of spirituality that is not only about the grand or the gilded or the gold, but also reflects on the small moments of community. And I think Studio Bound's piece in the Biennale in particular is so beautiful in that regard, because it's reflecting on and claiming the spirituality of a small everyday mosque that people have given over as acts of generosity by themselves as part of the holy boundary. Do you want to speak a little bit more to that?
No, I mean, yeah, so the piece itself, just like when we speak about, and I think it relates again to a lot of the things Chris alludes to, this idea of time, because when we talk about these engines of statecraft and these mechanics, they are all time, I mean, one question is whether they're timeless or not, right? This idea of timelessness, and with the idea of our work in the Biennale, at least in art, in my thesis, like in our thesis, these architectures are not timeless. There's nothing timeless about the architecture of the mosque. It's really about the inhabitation of the mosque that allows it to become timeless. The building itself, it's not to assume that the building is irrelevant, but this timelessness related to the piece related to the spaces in our piece, it's more about May has alluded to, it's the acts of generosity attributed to how people come together. So for us, the element of statecraft, or whatever you call it, is rendered through their absence in the space of Mecca, which is depicted quite physically with these stone tiles within the Biennale. And it really speaks about the temporal quality of these spaces. And I think this temporality is something that is quite poignant in Chris's work, because the legacy left by the Ottomans, they are timeless, but my question to Chris actually is, what makes them timeless? I don't is it the agency attributed to them? Is it the format? That's, I feel, something that I would like to hear from Chris as well. With regards to the infrastructure of Hajj, what has remained timeless? And what is timeless in that sense? Because time,
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I really struggled with when I started to think about this project. There's so much work that, again, gets to this sort of written narrative of a kind of nostalgia, where one describes the Hajj as similar to the way in which you've read about it in previous accounts, right? One of the things I wanted to do was to make sure that through bureaucratic documents, and in particular Muslim empires' bureaucratic documents, was to sort of ground the experience as a kind of rupture. That the 19th century was in fact not timeless. It was radically new and as I mentioned in the paper, quite traumatic, right? Of course there are elements of the original experience that remain timeless, but the experience of making the journey changed quite dramatically and radically. In terms of what's left behind, I mean, I think this is a really difficult question. I think here is what is erased. I mean, so much of the Ottoman legacy in Mecca and the Hijaz is erased. I mean, I was quite pleased to see in the Mecca and Medina Pavilion just how Ottoman those artifacts happen to be. But I think it is a broader issue about heritage preservation in Saudi Arabia of where the Ottoman legacy is and is not.
Yeah, and I think that the question of timelessness in a city like Mecca is a very important question, because at least through our work, I think Mecca, for me at least, is a city that has always, in its essence, designed to change. It caters for a global population that's ever growing, so in that sense, it cannot be timeless. It is timeless, but it isn't at the same time, and I think that's the difficult, that's the challenge that I try to also resolve through our work with dealing with places like Mecca.
But it is also interesting when you look at old etchings and images of the Haram, that the elements are still essential and the same. And I think perhaps the timelessness is, as you reflect on your piece of the Biennale, these rituals that we associate with around the Kaaba and in Mecca, that is, that is somehow ever constant and ever present, despite all the change and despite everything that's been erased.
I think there's actually an interesting dialogue, argument, conversation happening between permanence and erasure across the two exhibitions, across Studio Art's contributions in both exhibitions, and I think in both of your works as well. And the other thing I will pick up with really quickly and then open it up for Q&A from the audience, because we definitely want to give you guys a chance to speak and participate, is to also think about what's happening in the Islamic Art Biennale, what Studio Mount's practice, and what Chris is doing. Sorry, I felt very formal saying Professor Lowe. What Chris is doing as important, it's like they all highlight the value of the archive. And archive is central to architectural practice. It preserves things that are being erased or being terrified for future. In some sense, it is the diagram or it is the diagram for the top things. Chris uncovers the diagrams of top things past, and you guys preserve the diagrams of the present for top things of the future. So on that note, very intrigued, but I'm going to open it up to the Q&A, to the audience for Q&A.
one in the back.
So I was wondering, as it has been a large impact to our history, quarantines and illnesses, and how fast they have spread throughout the world, how have we learned to accommodate ourselves in the future accordingly, now with Corona, and hopefully not future illnesses and future pandemics? How are we prepared for that?
I think this is a wonderful question. You know, it's a tough question. I mean, it depends on where. And I spent a lot of time during the pandemic reflecting on this, right? So, you know, the pandemic started in, you know, March 2020. The book came out in October, and so I was doing all these talks about quarantine and cholera in October, November, December. And I had a fellowship at NYU Abu Dhabi. And so I moved during the pandemic in August 2020. And I don't know how many of you sort of know how Abu Dhabi was in the pandemic. It was very, very strict in terms of its sort of lockdown procedures. So I believe I went through 3 full 10-day quarantines in the apartment throughout the year. And of course you had the wrist bracelets, the GPS system, etc. And it made me think a lot, right, as you turn the news on and I'm reflecting back on the United States, right? Very different experiences. And I think there's an open question, what did we learn? It depends on where, right? And I just want to say that from my experience here, I actually thought that there was a certain level of responsibility taken to make sure that people were safe, to do everything that could possibly be done to take care of the population. Whereas at home, that was not the case. So again, I'm not sure that all of us imbibed the lessons of this last pandemic. So I think that's still an open question.
I'll refer back to our exhibition. I think the part of our exhibition, Accommodations, which aims to really address this is the home space. Because in the home space, one thing that we have learned from this pandemic is our embrace of technology so easily. And I'll just preface this by saying I don't think the pandemic introduced this as a novel concept. I feel this was a trend that was already happening, and what the pandemic really acted as was an accelerator for like a societal trend that was already in motion. So what we have learned, I think, is just how to quickly readapt within the confines of our home space and within our own personal space. And in that regard, we really do index the exhibition as not only being one of retrospection, but also being future-looking and addressing future questions of what it means to live and coexist together, which is ultimately, I think, also a very personal answer. I don't think there's a consensus.
I mean, I'm going to be a bit of a negative Nancy, but like the people who kind of predicted this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, basically say that it's going to happen more again and again in the future. And one of the kind of ideas that we were hoping to explore in our exhibition is to really question the idea of quarantine, like what is lost through quarantine. Because quarantine is an incredibly effective public health measure. But what do we lose? And the flip side of that, I would argue, is that like the spread of illness, unfortunately, is just part and parcel of cosmopolitanism, of community, of gathering. So the real question is, how do we negotiate between those two poles? Because neither one kind of is okay or safe.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly what you said, which is a deeply personal reflection also. But I think for me, the one thing that I really felt very viscerally is the loss of community that we had. And I also was working on this theme of the Biennale, on the themes of overweight and how we construct belonging and construct home during the pandemic. I first met the cultural strategist who appointed me on the project. During COVID, I was doing a talk on Zoom about a project I was working on in London, and it was Ramadan, and I was reflecting on the difference of this Ramadan and the loss or the renegotiation of so many of our rituals and the loss of a community